Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so here's the thing. Empyre is one of these stories where I have to let this play out to see whether I like it or not. Issue number 0 was cool. It was a cool taster. Reading issue number 1, it's like, okay, like maybe I can get on board with this. I'm not really sure yet, right? It's kind of crazy because this doesn't feel like it should be a massive crossover event. And this might be one of those times when Marvel's shifting. Okay, so here's what Marvel does, guys. So those of you guys who are new, here's what Marvel does. Marvel never reboots anything. Marvel doesn't do it for whatever reason. They just say, if you want to read Spider-Man, just start reading now. And if you don't understand what's going on, well, that's your problem. So the reality is this might be one of those stories where Marvel changes things up in the landscape in order to make things easier for characters to be introduced in the MCU. And I'll talk about why that matters here in a second. But at the end of the last video that we did, we basically revealed how the Kree and the Skrulls had basically united under a single faction and were traveling to Earth for whatever reason, right? They were traveling to the moon. And we ended up finding out that this was to destroy the last of a race called the Kotati, which were the original race that inhabited the planet Hala alongside the Kree. And we talked about how the Skrulls had visited the planet Hala. They had taken some of the Kree, they took some of the Kotati, they took them to the moon. They said, build something, we'll be back in a year. And that resulted in the Kotati building a jungle and the Kree building a citadel. The Skrulls liked the Kotati more than the Kree, and so they chose the Kotati to join the Skrull Empire. This led to the Kree getting pissed off. They basically killed the Skrull delegation, reverse engineered the technology, and then the two groups have been warring ever since. Kind of a mouthful, but that's the history of the Kree-Skrull war in like 20 seconds. What seems to have happened here is that the Kree and the Skrulls have kind of abandoned their animosity towards each other and then joined each other in the singular cause of destroying the Kotati. And so when the Kree-Skrull armada showed up here and then the Avengers traveled to the moon to meet the Kotati were like, yeah, man, they want to kill us. And they were just kind of relying on the Avengers' understanding of the race's history and just kind of going forward from there. Then we ended up finding out the Fantastic Four were basically alongside this Kree-Skrull armada. So the indication was that they had joined the group. The reality of this is they're actually coming back from a mission, right? They're coming back from a mission in the Fantastic Four story where they basically have a Kree and a Skrull, and it's whatever it is. But the idea behind this, and this is one of the things that I don't like about Franklin Richards, it's one of the things I hate so much about Franklin Richards, is that when this happens, if Franklin wants to stay, and the response of Reed is, no, you have to go home. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. The first is because of the fact that, remember, Franklin Richards' powers are fading. We don't really know exactly why, we just know that they are. And the idea is to find out why his powers are fading, why he's losing them, and solve that problem. Now, that question was basically being answered in Fantastic Four X-Men, but of course, because of everything going on with
current events,
that story was put on hold, and Marvel's just kind of trickling out stories until we get to such a time as the stories are just being released with regularity the way that they used to. So I have no idea when that story's supposed to come out. I'm sure I could find a release date, I just haven't looked it up yet. But the other reason why Reed Richards basically tells Franklin you have to leave is because the story calls for it. The reality of this is that Franklin's powers are such that he could just phase the entire armada out of existence. He's like, he could just teleport them all to the other side of the universe or just solve the problem with a wave of his hand, and that would be it. Franklin Richards is more or less a plot device. Removing him from this removes that plot device, right? That's the thing I hate about Franklin Richards. He's a cool character when he's written and used correctly, the way that Jonathan Hickman did it. Most other writers don't know how to use Franklin Richards. They just write him out of the story. They're just like, he just has to go home and just go there and hang out there and watch cartoons or something, you know, just that's basically what it ends up being. But regardless, where Franklin and Valeria are more or less sent away, this allows Susan Storm to use her abilities to make the ship invisible and then infiltrate the lead ship from the Kree-Skrull armada. Right now, the funny thing about this is that what you have here is you basically have Kl'rt. Now, Kl'rt is an old school character. When I say old school, I mean he's been around since the 70s. He is the Super Skrull, and you guys have probably heard of him, but basically he's a guy who has the powers of the Fantastic Four, is more or less what it is, right? He's got Johnny Storm's flame abilities, he's got Susan Storm's invisibility, he's got Reed's ability to stretch, he can enhance his strength and take on the form of Ben Grimm. He's basically got all their powers, but what you have here is Hulkling at the same time, and that's what's so crazy, because technically Hulkling is the child of a Kree and a Skrull, so it makes sense he would be here, but we haven't seen him for quite some time, and to see him suddenly go from the Young Avengers to being the leader of this Kree-Skrull armada in this massive story is kind of wild. I think this is one of those instances where you're going to see Hulkling basically brought into the MCU, which is why he's being given such a high profile, because the reality of this is there's no reason for Teddy to be leading a Kree-Skrull armada that's heading towards Earth. No one asked for this, but like we're getting it, and I think it might actually be kind of cool. But basically what Kl'rt does is use his abilities to essentially reveal the ship of the Fantastic Four, right? He reverses the invisibility of Susan Storm. Now the other part of this is we end up switching directly over to the Avengers themselves, right? On the blue area of the moon, the home of the Kotati here. Now, the crazy thing about this is, again, you know, with Ui, or however you want to pronounce his name, you know, he of course is a long-standing character. We talked about him in the previous video, you know, that he was basically saved by Thor at a previous point in time, and he's currently leading the Kotati race. And again, he approaches the Avengers, even Captain America, he approaches them as something akin to like a kindly individual, right? Somebody there is something somewhat of a savior. But again, tapping into this idea of the MCU style concepts here, we end up having She-Hulk, who's basically given this sort of ember-based hammer, and then alongside the Kotati meditation, what it does is it basically gets rid of the rage she constantly has going on, and it allows her to channel back into her classic self, right? Where it was basically Jennifer Walters who had all the powers of She-Hulk with a personality of herself, right? So she wasn't infinitely strong like the Incredible Hulk is, but she could channel that super strength. That screams Marvel Cinematic Universe to me. The average audience, I think, would largely reject the notion that she's just a female version of Hulk because people want to see something new. They'd want to see something fresh and new. Having a Jennifer Walters who can Hulk out but control herself, I think is an interesting concept, right? It's a classic version of her character. Back when John Byrne was doing the character, is probably the most popular run she had. It makes sense to take her back to her roots. So I imagine you're probably going to see her thrown into the MCU or announced in the MCU at some point in time. But, you know, when you have the Kree warship coming in, Carol Danvers basically issues a kind of broadcast, right? Now, a lot of this is based on the fact that, remember, Carol Danvers was the leader of Alpha Flight, that basically she's not really doing that anymore. You got Abigail Brand that went back and took over Alpha Flight again, but Carol Danvers is still kind of a spacefaring character. She's been that way really since the Kelly Sue DeConnick run. And so what she does is issue a broadcast basically saying, like, this is an Avengers world, right? If you come here and you attack the Kotati, they're under our jurisdiction because the moon is Avengers territory. Now, the reality of this is, if you're talking about longevity, it doesn't belong to the Avengers, right? Like, this was basically taken by the Kree eons ago, right? Like I guess really by the Skrulls, if you want to call it, if you want to go that route. But it's not really an Avengers moon, right? I mean, this is the property of somebody else. All the Avengers are really doing here is they're planting a flag in somebody else's backyard and saying, this belongs to us now, right? Like, that's more or less what it is. But the fact is that it is the Earth's moon, therefore they say it's under our jurisdiction. And then in turn, you have Tony Stark, who kind of makes a comment saying, hey, like, if it were me, I would just attack you guys. But then he's met by Reed Richards. And Reed Richards, you know, with Tony basically kind of chiming in as, you know, listening to this conversation, is kind of talking to Reed as Reed is talking to Hulkling, and everybody's trying to understand what's going on. Why is Hulkling from the Young Avengers now leading this Kree Skrull armada, which is a huge step up? But what ends up happening is he basically says, like, he's united these two factions because they have been warring for so long. But the truth is that he just kind of seems to be used, right? Reed Richards almost draws that conclusion, right? He says, if you have the Kree and the Skrull who have been waging war against one another, then it makes sense that this alliance didn't suddenly come because of Hulkling. He didn't do anything here, right? He didn't bring these two factions together. This alliance came together before him. But what they needed in order for both the Kree and the Skrull race to buy into this alliance was to have someone who was from both worlds that could unite these races. And that's where Hulkling came into play. He's a combination of both. And it makes the most sense to grab him and bring him in. He's a figurehead here. The other part of this is that from the perspective of Tony Stark, that's not true. From the perspective of Tony Stark, Hulkling's just being used. That's his whole stance, right? That where Hulkling says he trusts Super Skrull and he trusts T'Noth implicitly, both of which are individuals who have been shown over the history of Marvel Comics to have nefarious practices, that Tony Stark looks at that and says, but like, they're basically bad guys. Super Skrull's been an enemy of the Fantastic Four and the X-Men for I don't even know how long, and so is T'Noth. They've been bad guys forever. Like, if you really believe you're not being used for them to wipe out the Kotati, then I don't know what to tell you. That Hulkling's just being used here. That's all it really is. He's just being used to achieve a particular purpose. And so at the end of the day, Iron Man basically makes the first move. He launches the first strike. And one of the coolest things we get here is Ghost Rider basically using his power to charge the Quinjet and turn it into a Ghost Rider Quinjet. This looks amazing, right? It's got this giant gaping maw. It's on fire. It looks awesome. It looks so cool. But the funny thing is, when the question's asked, you know, really by Reed, when the question's asked, hey man, like, is there some way we can find diplomacy here, right? When Reed asks the question to Hulkling, can we find diplomacy? There's got to be some way to stop this. The response of Hulkling is no, launch your attack. Like, he basically tells them, let's go to war. And it's kind of wild here because it just seems very uncharacteristic of his character. And I imagine Hulkling fans would probably be pissed. I don't really know how you could be because, you know, we don't really know enough to be mad about it, right? We don't really know the whole picture here. Now, if the story does end and there really is is no explanation and he just is out of character, sure, then I guess you could be mad. It's kind of wild, you know, because with the fleets making their move and basically going in to attack the Kotati, what you end up getting is, of course, the Avengers and everybody looking to protect the Kotati. One of the coolest things that you get out of this is you get Black Panther's Buster armor, Black Panther's space armor. It's cool, right? To have Black Panther don this suit that allows him to basically leave the blue area of the moon and to travel into space. And it makes perfect sense. One of the things that I think is really overlooked about T'Challa, Wakanda, all that kind of stuff is that yes, they're they live on Earth, and for the most part, you don't really see Black Panther like exploring the universe outside of, you know, either being part of the multiversal Avengers or the Universal Kingdom of Wakanda, whatever it is that you want to call it. But like having him out in space like this and sort of elevating him up to that stature is awesome, right? We've seen it before, but it's just kind of cool to see again, because most stories involving his character, he's just on Earth fighting some people who are trying to invade Wakanda or fighting alongside the Avengers or something like that. But one of the cool things is you end up having Thor working alongside Tony Stark, and Tony's responses initiate phase 2, right? Where Captain America asks, like, do we have a plan to stop these guys, right? Or are we really hoping that we can just fist fight an armada composed of the two oldest and most powerful races in the universe and somehow win? And the response of Iron Man is, yes, we have a plan. Thor chucks his hammer into the air with an Iron Man device kind of built around it. And of course, it goes flying through, and it basically goes up in kind of an arc and then comes back down again. And when it does, it basically penetrates through the gravimetric shield based around this prime ship and comes crashing down to where Hulkling is. And in something that I've never really seen before, Hulkling lifts up his sword and blocks it and holds it in place. And that's kind of crazy because that's something that we haven't really seen all that often. The problem with this is that the way this story is being done, it almost kind of falls flat. And this should be a bigger moment, right? Because it's not something that you see very often. We've seen people catch Thor's hammer, but like to actually block it in that way. The other part of this is that because Hulkling isn't a character that's all that celebrated, really all that great, the moment's kind of lost on it. But there was no real build up here for the character of Hulkling. He's just suddenly blocking the hammer with a sword, and it's like, okay, but what happens here? And the reason why this is really a big deal is because what it did is it allowed Iron Man to basically initiate a remote viral package. And what it does is it shuts down all the ships of the Kree-Skrull Armada. Now, this is a big moment because the entire basis behind why this was happening, at least why it was that Hulkling was involved here, was because from his perspective, he was being told the Kotati are a threat to the universe. But from the Avengers stance, the Kotati are just some peaceful plant race, right? They're like tree huggers to the extreme degree. And there was no reason to ever believe that would be the case. As soon as that ends, you end up having Uwe, or whatever his name is, who basically says like, thank you, Avengers, you finally helped us. He dons his battle armor, they begin the flowering, and the whole idea here is to basically wipe out all flesh-based entities across the universe, to get rid of all forms of organic life that are not plant-based. It's basically M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening is more or less what this is. You know, Kui basically takes all these guys out. The Avengers, more or less, they're not, of course, not killed, but they are subdued. And the idea is, like, at this point, we're now going to spread the Empire. Like, we're going to spread this across the cosmos, and we are going to eliminate all organic life across the universe and take back the entire universe for ourselves. Now, this is where I say, you gotta kind of let the story play out, because if I'm being honest, I don't really have a whole lot of interest in seeing a whole bunch of walking plants conquer the universe. It's not really interesting to me, right? Just a bunch of like Groot's cousins conquering the universe. It's weird, but it could get better. And that's the important thing to understand here. It could get more interesting. I don't know. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Now we'll catch you all later. Peace.